Welcome to Correspondents on TaiwanPlus. Today we talk about Asia's tentative steps to open up after the pandemic. While many parts of the world, including Europe and the US, have started lifting COVID restrictions, here in Asia there is a reluctance to end border controls and quarantines. After closing its borders in March 2020, China's rules rank among the world's strictest, with at least 2 weeks of quarantine. Hong Kong also has some of the world's toughest restrictions, with 3-week quarantines for travellers from certain countries. Taiwan has had only 2 local cases reported in the first 2 weeks of October, but most foreigners have been kept out since early 2020. Singapore is gradually opening up, with quarantine-free access for vaccinated travellers from the US, Canada, and a handful of European countries starting October the 19th. And tourist destination Bali is opening up to visitors from 19 countries, but there are still no international flights to take them there. Hello and welcome. I'm Louise Watt from TaiwanPlus. Joining me today to talk about opening up after the pandemic is Nicholas Smith, Asia correspondent for British paper The Telegraph, and she's based in Taipei. Bill Birtles is a reporter in Sydney for Australia's ABC network and was previously ABC's China correspondent. So thank you both for joining us today. So first, let's talk about China. China has low case numbers, and yet it still shows no signs of opening up or learning how to live with COVID. And in fact, it's been announced that next year's Beijing Winter Olympics will have no foreign spectators allowed. So Bill, you were living in China. Why is China being so protective?
A few reasons, I think. The first is that there does seem to be a correlation between places that have next to no COVID and fear of the virus. And I think domestically in China, after the whole pandemic began in Wuhan, after a few months, they'd managed to reduce COVID numbers down to such a small amount that people have become very accustomed to having no COVID in China. And for that reason, there's great, I think, anxiety about this illness within China domestically. So for the government, it plays pretty well to be able to domestically boast about how it's the only major country in the world that's been almost able to eliminate COVID or eliminate it, and from time to time, when it comes back, suppress it. But second of all, I think we're about 1 year out from the 20th Party Congress. You know, this is a power reshuffle in the party. And the year leading up to these major once in every 5-year events usually is a pretty conservative year in terms of risks. So I can't imagine in the 12 months leading up to that big political reshuffle that Xi Jinping, especially seeing that he's determined to, break recent protocol and get a third term, I don't think he would look at reopening the borders and allowing some level of COVID to circulate as a particularly popular move ahead of that major meeting at the end of next year.
Away from China, Singapore is one of the first places in Asia to open up and experiment with a new normal. Nicola, why do you think Singapore is going ahead with that?
Well, the main reason it's going ahead with that is because it has 83% of its population fully vaccinated, which is now one of the most vaccinated, if not the most vaccinated country in the world, which gives it more flexibility to start reopening. And yet it's still a difficult journey to make. Back in June, ministers who were leading the coronavirus response said, they said very clearly, here's our pathway to reopening. It depended very much on mass vaccination, but also on still maintaining social distancing measures and people just taking on some social responsibility. You know, if you're sick, then don't go to work, for example. But they're still finding that case numbers are rising very quickly. Last week, Singapore, or in recent days, Singapore has been seeing numbers in the 3,000s of people who are testing positive for COVID-19. And it has to be said that the vast majority of these cases are, about 98% of these cases are mild or asymptomatic. And so people are being asked just to stay at home if they're sick. But it still is putting a burden on the healthcare system there. And Prime Minister Lee, a few days ago, gave a speech to the nation, trying to just lay out the latest developments. And he said it could be 3 to 6 months before Singapore can really return to a proper normal life.
And another place with low COVID cases, and also a place that people often compare to Singapore, is Hong Kong, another financial hub. And we've seen Hong Kong very much go in a different direction to Singapore. Hong Kong's still closed, still with 3-week quarantines. What kind of effect is this having on Hong Kong, Nicola?
Well, it's certainly having a huge effect on the business community. And there was a recent survey with the US Chamber of Commerce where they said that about 40% of their members were thinking of leaving and moving on. And even for, it's not just for foreign businesses, and it's also for local businesses, because they're facing quarantine restrictions when they go to mainland China, as well as if they come in and out of Hong Kong to go elsewhere, to go abroad. So that is a strategy that may well backfire on the government. Carrie Lam, the chief executive, appears to be very keen to impress Beijing and follow a Chinese model when it comes to keeping to a zero COVID policy. But she may well get a lot of pushback, and she already is getting a lot of pushback from both local and foreign businesses. And already after the Hong Kong protests, there was talk of foreign companies moving to Singapore, just over fears about national security law. And now this just compounds just the difficulties of operating in Hong Kong, which used to be seen as one of the major economic hubs in Asia, and it's definitely at risk of losing that status. And as well as the business difficulties, it's really having a psychological impact on the population. Anyone who I speak to in Hong Kong is just feeling stir crazy just now, and very trapped. And that's not really a situation that works in the long term.
Bill, you're in Australia, of course, where restrictions have been so tough that you haven't been able to travel from one state to another. How has that affected life over there?
Well, Australia's undergone a very big change in the last few weeks or the last couple of months in the two most populous states, New South Wales and Victoria. So Australia was a bit like Taiwan, somewhat like China, also like New Zealand, and had successfully kept COVID out for the most part with closed borders. People were very happy with that. But then the Delta strain got in, it blew up in New South Wales, it's now blown up in Victoria. And Australia did what it's been doing before, lockdowns and restrictions and all these sorts of things. And it wasn't working this time. So it caused a big policy rethink here in Sydney. And now the attitude of the New South Wales government is the opposite. Basically, it's incentivised everyone to go out and get vaccines. The first jab rate in New South Wales is incredibly high. It's near 92%. In recent days, we've seen people going out in Sydney for the first time since the opening up. And in Melbourne, something similar has been announced. There's a roadmap once enough people down there get vaccinated. And the funny thing about Australia is, it's a federation. And so you have other states that are kind of going the opposite direction. Queensland and Western Australia in particular have been incredibly successful at keeping COVID out. And they haven't had any outbreaks during this period because they've kept their borders closed to New South Wales and Victoria. And now New South Wales and Victoria said, the heck with it. We're not pursuing COVID zero anymore. We're going to live with the virus. We're going to get our vaccinations really high. And it's caused some consternation in those other states where they were kind of hanging on to the COVID zero thing. So although there is a national roadmap to opening up, although those states have agreed to open up, you can tell that they're a lot more reticent to do so. And so this whole kind of thing we're seeing in Asia, where some countries like China and Taiwan are keeping the borders shut, other places like Singapore are opening up. Well, in Australia, we have kind of this debate internally between different states.
And looking at the region as a whole, I mean, it's quite striking the differences between Asia, Pacific, and Europe at the moment, because as you've said, Asia still pretty much closed. And then Europe, life's almost, you could say, gone back to normal with people traveling, people going on holiday and so forth. I mean, what kind of effects is this having on Asia, this difference, whereas it's free to travel in Europe, but in Asia, it's still pretty much locked down?
Yeah, there's not a lot of travel going on in Asia. I mean, I work for the ABC. We have a documentary program called Foreign Correspondent where you have to go to various places to make programs, and it's just been a near shutout in Asia over the past 12 months. We've had programs produced in, the Middle East, in Europe, in America, but in Asia, occasionally you can get a freelance crew to sort of shoot it remotely, but it's just been a lockout from Jakarta to Taiwan to China. Well, China's a lockout for all sorts of different reasons, but even places like Japan and so forth, it's just been very, very difficult. I suppose all I can observe is many Australians here were quite happy about these closed borders. I believe many people in China are as well. So just because the borders are shut, I think a lot of people in each respective country, it might not affect them that much. But obviously, if you're talking about Hong Kong or Singapore or some of these places which are hubs, then it's a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a different picture across Asia, isn't it? I mean, certainly in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Thailand, places like that, there's been a huge toll on the tourism industry. Especially in Thailand, where it makes up a large chunk of the economy. And so people have really been struggling, and especially people, daily wage laborers who are linked to the tourism industry, but not necessarily working directly for it. And it has had a huge economic cost, and that's set to increase as borders remain closed. But I think you do also have to kind of take a broader view of it as well. And it'll be interesting after the pandemic to be able to take some kind of stock take about, who handled it best. Because if you look at last year, and you have countries like the UK where almost 140,000 people died, and that's not normal. And so far there's been no accountability for that or repercussions, or even just taking a look at how could we have done things differently. And in Asia, in much of Asia, the borders have been closed, and there's absolutely no doubt that has saved lives. But at the same time, this year, Asia has kind of fallen behind so far. It's fallen behind Western countries, Western Europe, certainly the US, in terms of trying to reboot their economies and trying to get back to normal. And I think eventually that's going to even out. I mean, we have such vaccine inequality as well. Western countries who were hit so hard last year by deaths and illness really put a lot of effort into securing vaccines, and they took big risks on then unapproved vaccines, and that gamble paid off. It could have gone in the opposite direction. Thankfully, it did pay off, because now we have some great vaccines that are really helping us to re-emerge from this pandemic. But Asia was somewhat left behind in the vaccine race, and I think that's really taken a toll on people economically, certainly, and just on their ability to function in the same way that now we see Europeans doing.
Thank you so much to Nicola Smith in Taipei and Bill Birtles in Sydney for joining us today, and thank you for watching.